All right, guys, we're about to start. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm so pleased to be here with you tonight for this special discussion of Scott Ludlam's Full Circle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're on, the Yagara and Turrbal people, as well as the traditional owners of the land at which you're all joining us from on Zoom. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Firstly, just some housekeeping. The bathrooms are inside and upstairs. If you do post on social media tonight, be sure to tag us at Avid Reader and also Scott and Angela. At 7:15, we will host a quick Q&A. For everyone who is on Zoom, just type into the chat box and then your Zoom host will endeavour to pass it along to me. To purchase copies of Full Circle, we'll have them set up inside and you can go grab one after the event. And we'll also have Scott inside signing copies where you can go chat to him and get your book signed. In conversation with Scott tonight, we have Angela Dean. Angela is an environmental social scientist based at QUT. Her research explores how to promote engagement with conservation issues across diverse communities. Please join me in welcoming Scott and Angela.
Thank you very much, Yana, and thank you, Avid, for hosting us, and thank you all for joining us. I'd like to introduce Scott Ludlam. He will be probably a stranger to none of you and familiar mostly for being a federal Greens senator based in WA from 2008 to 2017. He served as Deputy Leader of the Australian Greens for a number of years and has also worked as a filmmaker, an artist and graphic designer. So this is Scott's first book, so hopefully he'll be addicted and write lots more and have more launches for us to come to. Scott, we mostly know you as a Greens senator, and you were the first casualty of the Australian parliamentary citizenship crisis in 2017. And then some of us may not have followed your adventures since then. Tell us about your journey since that time, what you've been up to and how it ended up in a book.
Right, so we start with the citizenship thing. Well, let's just skip over that.
Yeah, you can skip that.
So I moped around for a couple of months.
Yeah.
You mean like on? I'm just getting warmed up. I was already actually in discussion with these really lovely folk at Black Ink about writing a book. I told them I didn't want to do it. That wasn't me. It's going to keep doing that.
Oh, if you just, the speakers are that way, so try to play.
Try to sit this way. I'll just speak up so it doesn't have to be so extra. It keeps doing it.
Right.
Okay.
Sorry.
Anyway, this is fun, isn't it? So the idea for a book had already been floating around, and then suddenly I had all this time on my hands and realised that I was having all these quite big questions that it's difficult to engage with really big, deep political thinking, not that there's a lot of that in there, when you're in that crazy job, because you're dealing with emergencies of other people's making every single day. So I just figured, all right, fine, it's time to do it. Took off and spent a year on the road, and a book emerged out of the interviews and conversations and experiences that I had.
You describe a lot of the book and all my favourite parts. There's lots of favourite parts of the book, so I'm allowed to have 10 favourite parts. But a lot of my favourite parts are about the stories of meeting grassroots activists or emerging green activists across the world, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Mongolia, Brazil, South Africa, and more. What are the main... Tell us about your experiences with those, and what do you love about it? What do you get out of those experiences?
Oh, that's my favourite thing to talk about. We could just do a full hour on that. So the Greens, to my kind of political tradition, being in the Green movement and anti-nuclear politics and the peace movement in Australia, all of those are globally extended social movements. So the Greens are part of the global Greens movement, which has emerging parties and some quite established parties in places like Germany and New Zealand, all over the place. But in places like Lebanon or Mongolia, they're outside the political establishment, in some cases deeply corrupt, oligarchies, which are quite violent and quite risky to try and crack into from the outside. So at the end of 2017, the first one that I did was a series of training workshops and so on for the Green Party Lebanon. I've never been to Lebanon before. I know they taught me a lot more than I taught them, but it was just a sense of, how do you go from being civil society organisers or working on popular environmental campaigns to actually knocking seats off and taking oligarchs out of Parliament, which is really heavily set up to prevent people from breaking in? And I just absolutely loved it. First thing you notice, most of the heavy lifting is done by women. Second thing is, we are in this blessed part of the world. I know it's tough for us here and that we're up against very significant challenges, but my goodness, there's so much courage out there. People who just really are aware of the risks that they're facing in places like the West Bank, and that's very much present on all of our minds at the moment, I suppose, or Mongolia, which has a pretty unsettled political tradition. We're going up against national security states in places like India, where Aboriginal people in the eastern part of India are going up against the nuclear weapons establishment. So my favourite part is just the spirit with which people come to this work. It's just like, we're just doing this, we have nowhere else to go. Creativity, spirit, people working with very little resources except dignity, I suppose, can do really incredible things.
One of the stories that really captured my interest was about the peace boat. So this is where victims of Hiroshima who are still alive, or their children, travel the world to understand the history of Japanese imperialism, have advocated it for getting into textbooks, but have also met with victims of Maralinga, so our own nuclear victims in Australia. Can you tell us about how you got onto the peace boat and something of the experience of that and that importance of collective memory and sharing it?
How I got on was just by blagging. I told a friend of mine, so it's a big Japanese-based NGO that charters a cruise ship and uses it as a floating peace university. And just before COVID smashed the whole world up, we were here. The last time I was in Brisbane, we floated in a peace boat. We were here for about 10 hours and then went on our way to Cairns. And so what they do is it's paying passengers, kind of a budget cruise outfit based out of Tokyo, full-sized cruise ship. Not super flash like some of the ships that you would see through here, but it's a floating peace university. So they would take on trainers and activists and organisers in each port who would sail with them for a couple of hops and would conduct trainings and workshops and cultural exchanges on the ship. And then on shore, they would do events with local activists and organisers. So in Australia, we did this big swing in 2018. It was the Hibakusha, it was the Japanese atomic bomb survivors, meeting with survivors from Maralinga. So Aboriginal people from Central Australia who were also survivors of these nuclear weapons. In the course of, or dedicated to the protection of the collective memory. So their dedication is that they want to be the last ones to be exposed to these weapons. So I adore Peace Boat, and a friend of mine has been working with them for as long as I've been involved in politics, and I basically just was annoying and wouldn't leave her alone and said I would sleep on deck.
There's a workshop on blagging after.
Yeah, there is. The whole movement was held together by rubber bands and blagging. And so I spent quite a few weeks with them in 2018 and then again in 2019. And hopefully, pandemic permitting, when they get back at sea again, if you ever see them come through port, spend a bit of time.
So were you present with the Maralinga victims as well? Can you tell us a little bit what it's like to be present when people are discussing the history of such gravitas?
I suppose that was the stuff, like I came through the local anti-nuclear movement from the late 1990s, and we can't spend any time at all doing anti-nuclear work, whether mining or waste dumping, nuclear weapons campaigning, without realising that it's strongly Indigenous-led by Aboriginal people who didn't choose these campaigns. They were chosen by them, particularly very strong women. And so I just kind of incidentally and accidentally, by the end of the 1990s, had put myself in service to them. These very deeply grounded intergenerational movements, again, all against all these various forms of dispossession that continue today in places like the Galilee Basin and elsewhere. And I trust them, and I've learned a huge amount from them because their movements are held together not with, post-it notes and whiteboards, but by this kind of intergenerational connection to country, by humour. They're very funny, and they're absolutely uncompromising because they had nowhere else to go.
One of the things you raise is the importance of maintaining collective memory, often of terrible injustices. And you quote Milan Kundera, who's one of my favourite authors, so that was also exciting, but about the importance of that. And yet so much of the cultural narrative of being Australian is about this collective amnesia. We talk about Australia Day and Anzac Day, about forgetting, suppressing or creating counter myths to avoid the challenging conversations. How do we face up to this, and how do we encourage people who are uncomfortable facing up to this, because they are difficult stories to tell and to hear? People are psychologically maybe want to self-protect and avoid those conversations. How do we bring a broader range of communities into those conversations without threatening them or scaring them off?
Oh, that's such a good question. It is like the erasure of collective memory feels like a key part of the colonial project. So to do what's been done on this ground, which is what Kundera was pointing out in his context was Eastern Europe, but for us, it's just wiping it out. It's mostly about the absence. If you go to the Australian War Memorial, to this day, there's nothing about the Frontier Wars. So it's these absences that are, I went through primary school in Western Australia in the 1970s. I didn't hear the name of the local traditional owners until I was in my 20s. And so I think, to get to your point about what do we need to do, I think it's actually happening. Look at the very rapidly changing nature of the Australia debate every single year. Used to be this irrelevant thing. I'd just climb up into the roof of my folks' place and watch fireworks. Used to be nothing. Australia Day didn't used to be anything at all. Then it got weaponized by John Howard, who turned it into this loyalty test. And now there's this immense kind of cultural pressure building up behind the concept of Australia Day. That's like, no, let's talk about what happened on that day and what flowed from it. And it's moving really quickly. So I think the conversations are happening. They obviously need to happen faster. And for me, it feels like we have to make sure that it's not just about the symbolic existence of memorials or days or how we think about these things. It's always got to have to come back to occupation and land. Until we're having this conversation in a very serious and systematic way about land rights, we're just going to be fooling around at the edges.
I'm going to start to ask you about politics and being involved in parliamentary politics. How did you survive? It must be awful.
Absolutely awful. I love the airport. I miss it every second, most seconds.
What took you to parliamentary politics?
You're going to get maybe bored of me talking about anti-nuclear work, but that was my pathway in. I was volunteering for a group. The coordinator of that group, this is in the late 1990s, where things were really popping off. Got himself elected in 2001 to an arguably quite conservative electorate, so the whole northwest WA. I volunteered to go staff for him. We had such a ball. Because even though you're in a minority, we had balance of power in state parliament. When we went to work for federal politics, we didn't have balance of power. This is the work choices era. where we had John Howard in control of the House and the Senate, we were getting smashed. We didn't win a vote in 3 years, and I loved every second of it. Because not because that's my kink, but it's more.
It clearly is.
This is for a different session.
Okay. After the signing.
More that the issues that we were getting to deal with were like stuff you could really get your teeth into. We were still doing anti-war work. We were still working on waste dump, and even if you don't have the balance of power, or even if your votes don't always matter, you've still got access A, to the soapbox. People will give you a microphone, and B, you've got access to all these other levers and tools of the legislature, the library, the ability to travel, staff, the access to the committees, access to, you know, all the machinery that a parliament is able to give you if you know how to work it. And so I just absolutely loved it. It is hard. If you see Larissa, tell your lover.
We do.
We do. And like all the folk working in there, it burns through staff quite quick. Like the dwell time of people working in those offices, it does churn through folk pretty hard. And so, yeah, every now and again, you get to ruin the day of the most awful people. That makes up for the other days.
I think we've got a new slogan to inspire people.
It's a bit long for a bumper sticker.
Okay.
And it's not very positive, is it? Like 3 times.
Okay, really long bumper sticker. You can go across the whole width, or maybe the spine of the book.
Of your bicycle.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. Go all around the helmet twice. I like the story you have of a Mongolian politician. I think it was a former PM. So you talk about, I'm sure we can all think of many examples of people who you say go into politics fired up and radical only to become an obedient cog in institutional machinery. So we see that from time to time, very enthusiastic people get silenced. And yet this particular PM actually became radicalized in the process.
Yeah.
What happened to him, and how did you stop becoming a cog in a machine that was damaged and bitter?
I have a damaged a bit.
That's
I never got
as well. Okay.
But no, well, let's take the 2 quite separate questions. So this is Mr. Enkbayer. So at different times he was the Speaker, the Prime Minister, and the President of Mongolia, which kind of got cut loose from the Soviet Union when it fell to pieces in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when that was all coming apart. So this guy has gone into the Mongolian parliament for opposition, campaigning on deregulating the mining sector, giving access to resources companies to come in and just loot the place, and there's going to be rivers of cash coming through Mongolia, and finally everybody's going to have a shiny car. He gets elected, and then the next thing you know, there's this kind of massive system-wide tax avoidance. These people are not nice people, and the country is kind of being torn to pieces. So he, with his colleagues, came up with the idea of the mining super profits tax. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. So we want, so the Constitution says these resources belong to the people, so we're going to start to tax these foreign mining multinationals, and build this enormous popular groundswell, as you can imagine, of, yeah, this wealth belongs to the people, and it's costing them their environmental amenity, destroying the pastoral lives of the nomads, destroying water resources. Climate change hadn't started really properly kicking in at that stage. And so they got rid of him. They organised to smash up his reputation and knocked him off. This is when he's reading the WikiLeaks cables. So he's reading the State Department archive, which by then is in published form, courtesy of Julian Assange WikiLeaks, noticing that the embassies and the State Department in particular are just the intelligence gathering arm of Rio Tinto and its foreign multinationals. And they knocked him off. Then they had him thrown in prison. So there was a big campaign by Amnesty International, and they got him out of prison, and he's now actually formally barred from running for re-election. But I was just sitting there listening to this guy, very charismatic, basically running 30 years of history of Mongolia through this storytelling, and feeling like I feel very at home here. You know, there's a Green Party in Mongolia that's working from the margins, trying to win a measure of power, but its potential is unrealised. There's a popular Prime Minister who's had his political career destroyed by the mining sector. Climate change is starting to bake the place dry, and it just felt like this is legible. Like I get the sense that the operating system of global capital, and particularly the resources sector, is more or less identical. It's more violent in different parts of the world, but its repertoire and its range is very narrow. Whether you're here, Mongolia felt like it's far from home as I've ever been. But it's like, all right, I feel like I've kind of clocked this place. I've been here for 20 minutes and there's stuff here that feels very familiar.
One of the elements, there's a lot to bite off to sort of fix in the world, and issues to throw yourself into. But one of the big challenges that's central to basically everything is this issue of state capture. You talk about the corruption in public institutions. It's not just in Mongolia or other countries. So Australian intelligence agents in Timor were providing intelligence to gas multinationals.
Yeah.
You say that public institutions have been repurposed to serve and support parasitic private resource extraction. And the resource sector control the ministerial wing of parliament and hold absolute majorities in both chambers. One of our major parties is wholly owned, the other is divided, traumatised and compliant. This seems a pervasive and at times insurmountable problem. We've got things like donation laws, which are a little small starting to chip, but how do we really tackle these issues? Should people in environmental movements shift into democracy, transparency types of movements? What do we do?
Depends on the definition of we, but great question.
Us here and the world.
Us here, right? Well, let's start, yeah. The first thing to my mind, I came across the concept of state capture in South Africa when I was there, where a bunch of academics and political organisers released a report on how a tiny handful of families post-apartheid had assumed control of a huge part of the South African economy in form that didn't feel like corruption. It was much more systematic and organised, and no laws were necessarily being broken. But at the same time, they were doing this in the context of a raucous and pretty freewheeling press. They were able to say these things, they would have opinions, they were able to go to meetings, and they were like, well, we're not in an oligarchy, but clearly this is more than corruption. And they named this place in the middle as state capture, which had been recognised in Eastern Europe, in post-Soviet Eastern Europe, in post-colonial Africa, where the trappings of democracy is still there. It looks like things are still functioning. You probably have the freedoms to have strong opinions, but clearly something has come a bit unhooked or a bit unmoored, something's not right. And state capture they defined as this process of whether it's a handful of families or a religious sect, or in our case, the resources sector, a block of investors, have captured the rulemaking processes. And that's what makes it different and sets it aside from corruption, because no laws are getting broken. They don't need to be passing bags full of cash back and forth. The donations are disclosed, maybe in 18 months' time, but it's all above the table. The revolving door, if you want to, and a handful of people are doing this, you can map the movement between News Corp publications, the Queensland Resources Council, the Minerals Council, the Gas Lobby, and Parliament, or like senior staff or actual ministers, and then back around again. And some of these folk will do 2 or 3 circuits of this, and no laws are getting broken in that process. But just maybe biting off that little quote, this idea of repurposing of public institutions is that means democracy is kind of getting hollowed out. It looks like it's still there. One quick example of repurposing. A year or 2 ago, before the pandemic kind of bowled us over and set things back a bit, Extinction Rebellion in this town start gluing themselves to roads and using lock-on pipes, which would kind of come out of forest campaigns and anti-nuclear work. But you're probably familiar with this. You put your arm in a pipe, you clip a carabiner into a little bar in the pipe, and the only way to get you off that thing is with an angle grinder. And so you can seize up a couple of city blocks or an entire city for hours at a time. It's pretty disruptive. I also hate traffic jams, but you can't avoid these things. It gets us on the news. We did this in Sydney a couple of years ago, and not with a lock-on pipe, but it got me back-to-back interviews for 3 or 4 days talking about extinction. Why are you doing this? Why are you taking this provocative action? So I get that it's not for everybody. Nonetheless, it's a tactic in the repertoire. The Queensland Resources Council absolutely lost their shit and demanded that these pipes, that this particular tactic be outlawed. And within a week, your premier is at the podium introducing new laws. So that is institutional repurposing. Yeah. So an investor bloc has told a political leader and probably handed her the draft laws, because they used to do that in federal parliament. They'd be working the corridors with amendments. Then she's done that, and so now an investor bloc has repurposed not just the way the police can behave, but also the judicial system. That is not how we assume democracy operates. But that's a signature of state capture. What happened in Timor-Leste with the bugging of the cabinet rooms by ACES, by Australian Intelligence Services on behalf of the gas industry, state capture. So again, there's not a lot in the book about it. It's not a whingy sort of a book about, well, I guess we buggered them. It's more, how do you confront that?
It's
Firstly,
not whingy at all.
I hope
No, it's not. It's let's all go and do something.
Let's go and do something. What are the sort of somethings that people have chosen? First thing is name it up. This isn't corruption. But also, we're free to have this conversation. We aren't likely to get followed home. We're not going to be threatened for having this conversation. Let's seize those freedoms and go after this thing that is clearly more systematic and organised than ordinary corruption.
Can you extrapolate a bit on the let's go after this thing?
Okay, another
What are they
Queensland
doing?
example.
Yeah.
So one example again, Adani, they're meant to be shipping coal in 2014. Is that right? And if there's any Adani campaigns here, jump if I'm getting elements of this wrong. They have all of their state and federal paperwork in hand, and they have had for a while. And there's no election that we can shift. I still think we should elect as many Greens and Independents as we can, but there's no alternate government that we can install that's necessarily going to say stop Adani. They weren't going to stop it if 2019 federal had gone the other way. So what have they done? They've gone after the money. There's an essay in there called Burn the Money. It's like, all right, if we've lost the politics, we won't ignore it. We'll still use those levers where they're valuable to us, but we'll go after the money. So they have peeled off all of Australia's big four banks. Then they went after the little ones. They're all out. They've peeled off the global insurance industry. They've gone deeply into the supply chain. And so anything from little family-owned businesses all the way up to GHD have just gone, you know what? No, we're not working on this one. Through very adept campaigning, financial campaigning, market campaigning, but also human campaigning. You go into the bank teller and you say, I'm giving you this piece of paper because your bank is investing in this thing which is absolutely going to ruin all of our future. And internal pressure within the companies starts to have this effect on the corporate hierarchy. Like, well, this is not what our corporate mission statement says we're into, so maybe we just don't want to take the public hit, and they back off. So it's not a systemic example. I'm fascinated by what happens if we do that systemically. Blow up the money and also revoke the social license for these corporations to operate. Now it's apparent how much danger they're putting us in. And none of these things involve elections. There's a whole wide range of very interesting, juicy, fun and naughty things that we can be doing. And when the election comes around, for God's sake, like nothing in here says we should ignore the electoral process. These machineries, they're brittle and they're not great, but they were achieved at great cost, and we shouldn't walk away. They're inviting us to walk away, and so we shouldn't. But let's avail ourselves of the rest of the menu of naughtiness.
Yay, let's just go One of the challenges that sometimes gets that naughtiness gets criticised for is this whole taking the people with us type of argument. This notion that we need to build a broader scale support across those inner Australia or silent mums and dads or whoever these people are, but nonetheless build a broad support. And I guess some of the critique of more radical actions is that they might turn people off. Yep. They might shut down conversations. What's this balance between tackling the naughty things, throwing a brick through the window, a metaphorical brick or a real one, versus these more subtle or reformist approaches to navigating change? Can I just take a vote? Who would like to support people throwing bricks through windows metaphorically?
Metaphorical brick.
Yes, that's most people. So I put on your ad crowd.
Real bricks.
Real bricks. Okay, there's a
Handful of real bricks.
That's okay. I was assuring Scott that most of the audience would be sympathetic brick throwers. And thank you.
All right, so in our focus group, it's tested well. Okay, serious question though, that we're trying to build very broad-based social movements, or are we just going to let the radicals kind of charge, build barricades and do stuff even if it's divisive and polarizing? Is that the drift? Yeah. Well, it is a really tricky one. I don't know of any single social movement in history, certainly not in this country, that was led from the centre, that was led from the sensible centre, or that was led from moderate people sitting around going, oh, well, I guess so. Nearly everything that we value, from the wins of the suffragettes to the wins of the trade union movement to environmental campaigns, have been run by wingnuts who were hated in the day, right? By people who were reviled by the establishment. And it doesn't ever start as a broad-based social movement. It starts as a handful of units and outsiders who run the argument and kind of make it safe for the moderates and for the reformers to come after. Have a look at how marriage equality was won. And ultimately, it does end in a substantial majority of Australians in nearly every electorate around the country have voted for that. Shouldn't ever have been asked to, hideous experiment, but nonetheless, that's led by a handful of people. Then that campaign took 10 or 20 years, and there's people better placed to describe its course. But it always starts as a handful of folk who are going to be considered at the margins. Pick any campaign, trace it back far enough, work out who was in the room and who was doing the organising, being annoying before the sensible centre showed up, before the politicians showed up. They're generally the last ones to the party.
From a parliamentary politics, now that we've go off and be naughty after you've bought the book and gotten it signed. Within the parliamentary sphere, I guess, there's this tension about the role of, say, a party like the Greens versus other independents. Think about people like Sally Steggall, who knocked off Tony Abbott, who caused probably much rejoicing in the last election. Do you think, what's the role of, say, a clearly progressive party like the Greens attracting a broader range of voters who may be open to change, but culturally or from an identity perspective feel uncomfortable? So people who are liberal and might be sympathetic to climate action, but are not going to really vote for a Green or a Labor Party. Are independents the way forward, and how do we navigate that tension?
Different in all the different electorates, I guess. So my tradition is from the Greens, and so we're a minor party. We're not a new party. Like, our first MP was elected in 1984 in WA, so it's not like we're just popped out of nowhere. What I liked about it was that the platform is, and all the policies are developed deliberatively by this huge number of people who are collectively much smarter than me. And so I don't have to, I've read it and support it all, and it's been thought through and it's clever and it works and it kind of clicks together. And it means even though it's anti-nuclear work and climate change that's driving me into that place, when I've got a bill before me that's about tax policy or housing affordability, there's some thought has already been put into it. Now, for the independents, a lot of those folk I would get on very well with, you just see them being thrown into these bills where your vote matters. You are the swing vote. And so you better care about this thing, whether you care about it or not, because what you do is going to be on the evening news, and you can hurt people if you get it wrong. In a lot of things, a lot of bills come through that place very, very fast. I presume State Parliament's the same, and you can't afford to take your eye off it for a second. So the advantage of being in a minor party in that kind of sweet spot where we are is that it's impossible to grab an individual, take him to a back room, offer them a swimming pool for their electorate, and come back and you've shafted a whole demographic, or you've passed something deeply harmful, but you've got a swimming pool to put in your newsletter. So I'm here for the independents. I think it's healthy. Party discipline, I think, is actually the scourge on our politics. I wish it was less disciplined, even in the US or in the UK. MPs and backbenchers routinely tell their party leadership to ram it, and I wish that happened more often here. Anything, in my mind, that is involving cracking party discipline and rejecting checks by Santos is going to be helpful for democracy. It's just that it's not as simple as saying, let's just get a pile of independents in there and hope that they're not all going to behave like Bob Catter. For example, lovely guy, but like random. Yeah.
It's one of the scenarios you described, we're still on this radical versus reform sort of tension, even though we're going to go and be naughty afterwards, is
I love that you've really latched onto that.
Yeah, I have.
There's a whole pile of broken glass in corporate headquarters tomorrow.
Just needed the extra leverage. You describe how, say, after the Great Depression, but there's also similar stories, say, during some of the revolutionary movements in the 19th century, where the provision of labour laws and good social services actually mitigated the negative effects of inequality, but in doing so, stymied perhaps some of the more radical revolutionary urges that were going on in society. We want people to have those urges. We want people to bite off big change, but we also want good social services. Can we have both?
Yes, but it's a great case study, isn't it? So during the Great Depression in the US, they used President Roosevelt and his Labor Secretary, who was the first woman cabinet secretary in US history, who was, as far as I could tell, the brains of the New Deal. They used the tools of state socialism and central planning to save capitalism. Yeah, to save, they bailed out the remaining banks that hadn't already collapsed. They provided unemployment insurance. Most of the social safety net that exists still to this day in the US was introduced in the 1930s. And a whole pile of like child labour laws, and wasn't quite compulsory trade unionism, but Roosevelt was like saying, join your damn union, we need somebody to negotiate with. And they're using these tools to rescue capitalism, to kind of bring things back on the rails so that it could accelerate off again after the Second World War. And they were doing that because at the time of the Depression, which was caused by this massive financial crash, there's this incredible upwelling, this remarkable cycle of rebellion and transgression has kind of exploded across the US, of workers just seizing these closed factories and saying, well, we're just going to stay, and locking the bosses out. Militant strikes, the Communist Party kind of blows up in the US. And so they're introducing, the administration is introducing these policies as a way of heading that off and saving the system from itself. And then the next thing you know, you're in this massive extinction crisis because they were successful. So not at all the question you asked, actually, but here we are.
Okay, that's all right. Another one of the tensions, so you mentioned Kropotkin's mutual aid, about the importance of cooperating and not competing, which made some old West Enders quite happy, because there used to be a Kropotkin's cafe just down around the corner in Vulture Street, well before my time. One of the challenges is that environmental movements are not always full of pro-social people, and there's a certain element of Burn, sorry, no, I'm getting, you've got a section in here, a reference page 192. No, it's is about the role, I guess, of misanthropicness in the environmental movement, that this focus on people causing this problem has led some in the environmental movement to view people as the problem rather than part of the solution. And I love Carol Linnett's term, the misanthropocene. How do we, I mean, clearly the position you come from is one where the problem is capitalism, so social justice issues, environmental issues are all coalesce to be fighting that key problem. But is this going to be a common element in the environmental movement that we'll need to tackle, and how should we tackle it? So I'm asking you for lots of handy tips.
No, I love this. I'm really glad that you grabbed it, because I'm become a bit obsessed with it the more I think about it. That we're used to environmentalism and greeny stuff in this country being considered a bit left-wing, and the right-wing more or less leaves us alone. They hate us and they attack it, but they kind of leave those issues alone. But there's these strands of misanthropy that are kind of woven through Western environmental thought, some of it quite explicit and quite scary, but you hear it in a benign form when somebody puts their hands up and says, well, how come we're not talking about population? Are there any population folk? Like, why? Surely the problem is that there are too many of us and there should be less of us. And that trope is so easy to divert into, well, which kind of people are there too many of? And in Europe, we're already seeing this. The European hard right has already clocked the idea that climate change, which makes me as anxious as hell and is terrifying, can be actually quite handily bent into service of xenophobia. So we're going to have solar panels, we're going to have organic food, we're going to have concentration camps, and there's going to be really
with solar panels,
and a lot of drones, and we're just going to shoot people who try to cross the Mediterranean or the Timor Sea to get here. And you can see that our nasty right wing is halfway there. They're not ready to adopt environmental tropes and conversations and concepts yet, but I actually don't think they're that far from it. The worst thing that Greenie Crew or Extinction Rebels or white environmentalist type people like me could do would be like, oh, the right are interested in this now. Okay, we're all on the same side all of a sudden. We have to head that off. We have to be explicitly anti-fascist, anti-white supremacist environmentalists in an age of climate change. That was controversial. But we have to get in front of it because it's about to become controversial. Sorry to be such a downer.
Now that segues so beautifully to the next question, which is, you know, this We've seen terms like eco-anxiety and climate grief appear more often in our conversations. There are times we've looked at a news item about something being dreadful and gone, oh, and it's hit us hard. And yet your book, we've got an early naughtiness in training person. Lock on to the toys. And yet there is so much joy in the book as well. And that's wonderful. Like there's a story about refugee camps in Bangladesh, ER protests, the Extinction Rebellion protests, as well as the climate strikes. Tell us about the joy in those movements and your experiences.
I love that spirit of transgression, particularly when it's people trying stuff that hasn't been tried before. That you get these kind of runaway cascades. That Me Too is that, Black Lives Matter is that, school strike is that, Extinction Rebellion is that, where somebody just goes, you know what, let's just try something different. Occupy tried that in 2011. You know what, let's go do a demonstration where we don't go home at the end. And the next thing you know, there are hundreds of these occupations. And the whole structure of global capital is being questioned in these open, autonomous spaces parked out front of stock exchanges and banks all over the world. You have a new idea. High school student grabs a piece of cardboard and says, you know what, I'm not going to school on Fridays until my government brings its rhetoric in line with what's necessary. And the next thing you know, 2 years on, there are 7 million kids doing that. Yeah. So that's just these kind of recombinations where you take an old idea or something that's been done before and you hybridize it, or you just do something a little bit loose and you're also lucky and then it catches on at that moment and then away it goes. And Extinction Rebellion has done that as well. Well, you know what? We're not going to march around in a circle anymore and just go home. Even though I've done that heaps of times, it's lovely. You see people that you haven't seen in a while. It's great. I'm being a bit cheeky, but like I still think there's a benefit. We did a demo for Palestine this morning in Sydney. There are about 100 of us. We didn't get arrested. We didn't break any laws, but shit, it was good to see them. Social media posts, people kind of reconnecting socially. So I'm not down on doing traditional stuff and just being there as a presence from time to time. The fun stuff is where we accidentally or deliberately break a rule or do something that hasn't been tried before and it catches on. And we're not going to talk about it heaps tonight, but the mathematics of that are the same as earthquakes, forest fires, and epidemics. These runaway cascades in natural systems exist in human social systems as well, in industrial action, in strike waves. And I think that's really fascinating. You're there at the right time with the right idea and there's no way of predicting how big a movement can get. So we are in the throes at the moment of needing to be surprisingly big and effective at a planetary scale in a way that's never really been done before. But the science, the sociologists and the systems nerds and the people who study this stuff for a living say that's absolutely possible. Anybody who tells you that can't be done hasn't looked at the science, hasn't looked at the maths. It absolutely can be done, just that we haven't tried it yet.
One of the recent climate strikes, and there's another one coming up soon. Does anyone know what the date is? 21st. Okay, all get out there, buy a book, take it and lend it to someone at the college. I took a colleague to the climate strike before the pandemic who'd never been to any sort of rally ever before. And she just expressed over and over again about her surprise at how happy it was and about how joyful it was. She said, I thought this would be an angry thing, that people would be cross. And so I think that sharing the joy of these stories is so important to building that participation.
I went to a strike in Bega and it was one of the happiest events that I think I'd ever been to, and all I could feel was grief. That this kid is 11 years old, it's her first time on a microphone, and look at what she's talking about, why she had to do this. So it's complicated, isn't it? But yes, there is joy, but holy shit, why have we left this so late? That 11-year-old children are our movement leaders.
You do talk about how it feels like we're at a tipping point with that children at our leaders. So one of the things you mention is being at a climate strike, this must be how it feels to live on one planet. Dull nationalism slipping as we glimpse each other, recognising allies even when we can't always read the script on each other's handmade signs. Children, it's children who've done this. And you say at times it feels like something deeper is in motion. Are you a betting person? Are we on the cusp of something amazing? What do you think?
Yeah, if I was a betting person, I'm putting everything on that square. Because imagine if we're not, like, are we really just going to roll this thing off a cliff? So yes, I'm not really a betting person, but if I was, I'm betting everything on, we need to create a form of global civil society and global mutual aid at a planetary scale that's never been done before. There have been attempts in the past of various internationals, or the World Social Forum has tried to do, or the counter-globalization movement that arose in the 1990s. So folk who've been around the block a bit will remember. Every now and again this happens, these social movements that are kind of arising from grassroots all over the world. There's these moments that happen where they start to meet each other and start to form these cross-border alliances where we realize we're all working the same. We're working different dimensions of the same struggle. And then something happens. Sometimes it's just straight up state violence. Sometimes it's 9/11. Sometimes it's, I don't know what it will be next. They try and kind of check that momentum and throw that positive feedback escalator out of phase. But we have to build that because I don't think it's possible to confront something as deep and huge as climate change without that. We can't just, I mean, we've spoken of it already, we can't just kind of ring fence this place and make it go all solar. It's a planetary project or not at all. And every now and again you get it, you can feel that. I got that school strike, I got that first time I marched with Extinction Rebellion thinking, there's people marching under this flag in every time zone on the planet. And that felt really good, and more of that.
What would you like the one, I've got a million more questions, but these guys will have more and I don't want to hog you. What's the one message you'd like people to take from the book?
Buy the book.
And take it to a rally. Or make a cake for someone
Yeah,
going to a rally.
The one message is that whatever your idea is, whatever the thing is that you're scared about and doing in just the right way, the idea you've been sitting on, do that thing now. Like whatever is the crazy thing that you're interested in, that you would love to do that you haven't quite done, or the project you want to support or initiate or bring to fruition or just roll down the hill and see where it goes, do it now.
That's fabulous. I'm going to do that tomorrow.
We'll jump to our Q&A now, and we'll start with one question we got from one of our Zoom viewers tonight, Linus.
Hello, Zoom.
And they say, is Scott planning a follow-up book along the lines of Where to From Here?
Wow, that is also something of a burden. There's a certain amount of where to from here in this perfectly nice new book. Thanks for asking.
Watch this space.
I don't want to, maybe there's a follow-up book, I'm not sure, but I think for the moment, I'd like to have this conversation, see how this one goes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And from the crowd, does anyone have a question? Sorry.
Hi, my name is Rubina. I'm a member of the Greens as well. Apart from climate change, of course, I feel there are two really major issues in the world currently. One I feel is, of course, Julian Assange and his fate for having spoken the truth. And the other one is that of the Israeli brutal occupation of Palestine lands, where you've recently been. It's really, really good to hear that you paid a visit. Apart from your attendance at a recent Palestine protest or whatever in Sydney, just again, good to know. One doesn't hear too much about this, either of these two issues. Okay. Now, I know that Paul McHugh from the Fairfax some years ago said the narrative of the Palestine cause has been hijacked. But what about the Greens? I don't hear anything from the Greens about Julian Assange. I feel it is such a moral question. Or you do hear awake something from the centre, a statement or something, but not much.
No, we're there. We're absolutely there. So there's this great little cross-party group supporting Julian Assange, which is one of the more functional ways that you see Parliament operate, except you never see it because it happens more or less behind closed doors, where for whatever issue I was for a long time worked on the Friendship of Burmese Democracy, and Claire Moore, who I should acknowledge actually when I showed up, former senator and dear friend who is here, has spent a ton of time on these groups as well, and it's where you will see people kind of leave their politics at the door and just work out what can I get through my party room, or what kind of motion could we do, or like what guests can we invite into the Parliament, try to raise the profile of an issue. There's a great and very functional group at the moment working for Julian. From the Green side, it's mainly Pete Wish-Wilson and Janet. Adam pitches in and gives it momentum when he can. It's Janet as our foreign affairs spokesperson. Pete, I think, mainly because he knows John Shipton, Julian's dad, quite well, and I've spent a bit of time with John as well, and he's very compelling. So they are there, they're still doing the work. You may not hear it. There's a big role for all of us, actually, whether it be for Julian or for what's happening in East Jerusalem at the moment. Just in visibility and using our own platforms and our own audiences and friends to raise the profile of these things. There's a concentrated effort in both cases. I know they are kind of at 90 degrees to each other, for the conversation to just not be had. So the striking thing about the demonstration this morning at the ABC was and I mean, it may seem a bit unfair to single the ABC out, but their reporting is minimal on the violence in East Jerusalem at the moment. And the fact that there's further bombardment of Gaza overnight, in which another 20 people died, and the reporting, whether it's of the war crimes investigation that's begun, that Australia tried to kill, that we tried to block. Unless we're hearing about these things, it's as though, it kind of takes us out of the conversation. There's a really important role for us just in not letting Palestinian crew be invisible. So find out, because they've, crew are very active on social media, where is the next presence, where's the next vigil, where's the next demonstration or the march. The anniversary of the Nakba is this Saturday, which is the kind of one of the original very large-scale waves of dispossessions, people who've not been able to return home since. Is there a demonstration, 1948, is there a demonstration happening? We should do a quick call out actually before the end of the night and just make sure that we know where these things are. If there isn't one, hook up with local Palestinian crew and just help them be visible and not invisible, because that's one of the most dangerous things at the moment.
There is going to be an action on Friday the 14th.
Friday.
Yes, so it's in King George Square, and they're going to have a list of all the villages that have been destroyed.
Right.
And we would love everyone here to come along.
That's fine.
5:30.
That is awesome. Thank you. And thanks for asking. For Julian, I'm fascinated and grateful that those were the two examples that you chose, because we haven't spoken much of either of them tonight. He's in very serious situation. So the Magistrates Court in London in January actually found against extradition, which surprised nearly everybody. But the magistrate found in favour of all of the prosecution's argument, which effectively in the UK has criminalised national security journalism and defined it as espionage. It's an incredibly dangerous set of precedents that have been set. Then right at the end, before she gets up, she says, "Oh, but you can't have him because the US prison system is so sadistic that he simply wouldn't survive the process." And that wasn't melodrama. He's going to die in Belmarsh unless we get him out. And our government has done less than nothing to get him out of there. So again, it's a visibility thing at the moment. Two things you can do. Find out if your local MP is a member of that Parliamentary Friends group. Find out if they're willing to write to the US ambassador. Call them in. We used to do that all the time. We just call them into the parliamentary office and say, we want to talk to you about these three things. Julian is one thing. And then that is a cable that goes back to DC. It's like the Australians, the Aussies, they're upset with us. So that's something that your politician can do, but what we can all do is hop onto social media tonight and say, President Joe Biden, you don't have to own this. This is part of Trump's war on journalism. Let him go. Let him go.
Scott, why don't we hear more from the Greens on this?
I contest that a bit, because just because we say something doesn't mean it'll be reported. And we used to bang our heads on the wall. They are saying stuff. It doesn't mean it penetrates the glass.
Social media or wherever.
They're everywhere. You suss out Pete Wish-Wilson or Janet Rice in particular, because those are the two who immediately come to mind, but Larissa as well. She's joined us in stuff in working for Julian over the last 10 years or so. Like, you know, Parliament's a complicated place. There are 500 catastrophes unfolding all at the same time. If you don't hear us out every day on every issue, it's because they're juggling. Julian is one of the things they're juggling that they haven't dropped. They're still doing the work. But also, we're not in government. I think actually, credit where it's due, Albanese and the Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus just broke with bipartisan agreement with the Tories for the first time in a decade, and they said it's time for him to come out of avalanche and come home. I would like to know that that's being converted to action, but at least the message has changed, and that actually really matters.
So that was quite a meaty question.
Yeah, only light and fluffy stuff from now on. Yeah, go.
You talked about Extinction Rebellion, and I'm just thinking over the years, there's been real breakthroughs in some areas, and it's that sort of little lights at the end of the tunnel. And one of them, for example, is in the UK, where you've got the Wilding Project on a farm, which you probably know. We're going to promote the book in another month. And I wanted your opinion about how important these positive stories of success, because the one in the UK is a real template.
Yeah.
So I just wanted your opinion on that. It's a kind of positive, good news story.
What's the name of the book?
It's Wilding. It's called Wilding.
Yeah.
And we've got it here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know, I love it. I've been hocking myself. I'm totally free to do that. So, but the point is well made. Like the positive stories, there's this like crazy undercurrent within climate circles of doomers. Have we heard of that?
Yeah.
Which is, to me, is as damaging as denial. Is the people who it's like, you know, it's buggered, we're screwed, including people with quite big platforms, and just have to reject that completely. The story, not just because of false hope, which I think is worse than none at all, but because this is absolutely in play. You know, I strongly do not believe that we spent 4 billion years evolving up from slime just to crash everything in this present generation. Like that just doesn't seem plausible, does it? This is absolutely in play. And so the hopeful stories, A, like gives us a bit of a lift, and B, like, oh, could we do that here?
Yeah.
What could we do here? Like, what of those ideas could we hybridize and throw into our local context that might take off in a way that stuff might not have worked in the past? We absolutely need that. There's a ton of that in the book, which you can buy. I've been earning $3 an hour for the last 3 years. I need you to buy this book very badly. We totally need the positive stuff, not for the false hope, but for the real thing.
Right, we might have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I'll keep my answers a bit more disciplined.
Hi, my name is Lise. Less than 10 minutes away from where we are here, 2 years ago, we saw Peter Dutton and his cronies essentially rent a hotel, Kangaroo Point Central Apartments, and put the guys from Manus Island there, you know, who have been locked up for 8 years. There was a massive, you know, local groundswell, as we all know, around trying to support those guys who essentially organised themselves within the hotel prison. They organised their own protest movement out here. But the fences that were constructed around the hotel prison, which we've since found out were actually illegal, that circulated tried to put them up. Though people kind of touched them or pushed them, people would seem to lose their minds. We had the state Labor government take the protesters to court to try and block any kind of protest movement ever happening on the Story Bridge and setting that as a precedent in the Supreme Court. We had local protesters, you know, bashed essentially on the streets without any kind of accountability, and it felt like that a real tension between that like frontlines resistance work and reformist work was, you know, playing out right here at Kangaroo Point, and it felt like it was mostly a lot of young queer activists left to fend for themselves. I guess my question is, can we move forward on the refugee issue when we've got, you know, 35 people now in Park Hotel on Swansea Street in Melbourne that's been moved? Can we move forward, and what reflections do you have between that and the intersections of the climate movement, given what you've just said about solar farm concentration camps?
Oh, well, as someone from down south, I haven't received think it's about 2 years since I've been here. It gave me huge heart to see the demonstrations night after night at Kangaroo Point, because I couldn't be there, but it really helped to know that people were, and it kind of feels the same seeing Melbourne crew show up as well. And if I feel like that, imagine how the guys locked up inside those places feel. Just to know that there's some humanity on the other side of the wire. Can we make progress on it? I struggle with it, to be honest. Every time you think refugee politics in this country can't get more sadistic and deranged, it does.
But it's not today in Perth, the built a tunnel, like they almost got out under the fence, they built a massive tunnel underneath Yonga Hill. They almost got out, but they got caught, yeah, Yonga Hill. Yeah.
No, okay. Why are people having to do that? So these aren't hardened criminals, right? They've fled. Anyway, we all know the story. I think the main thing for this one is just to not give up. Like, as long as those people are incarcerated, we can't afford to feel sorry for ourselves and give up, even though it's hard. And even though there's still people locked up out there actually cashing checks and winning votes on turning the temperature up on this guy. So if we were to give up and just submit to despair, then it ends. And so of course we can't afford to look after each other. It's such a long-term one. Your question about the intersection with climate change is clearly, like, we can see that institutional setups are already in place. And COVID's just done it again in a really full-on way with actually, no, you're not a citizen. You don't have these entitlements anymore because you're trying to get here from India. It's not a big stretch of the imagination to imagine that taking this narrow little environmental turn and getting very serious very quickly, and certain quarters of white greenie crew going, oh, well, okay. So that's why I think it's quite important for us to have this conversation now and get in front of it about not just the anti-fascism stuff, but like, this is a planetary project and everybody is a human being in this together. You're not privileging one nationality over another just because we happen to have the ability to go solar fast. This is a planetary project, and it's the first one we've ever had to do.
I think that's one.
I'm
one
totally
more.
up for it. I'll give a really quick answer. Go.
I'll come over really quickly just so our people on Zoom can hear.
No, I'm up for more. I could stay here all
It's
night.
one
Me
of the
too.
stories from Wait Peace.
Well, what do you know?
I've got two questions, but you have to combine them in your brain. And so one is about the bipartisan security committee and its role in grooming Labor Party people to become part of the corporate sphere. I don't know, somehow they move through that committee, and then when they come out the other side of it, they're bad, evil bastards. And we've got Disrupt Land Forces here in 2 weeks, and we want everybody doing creative, exciting shit. And so we want you to, link the weapons industry into that discourse.
Awesome. This is one of the hardest or most courageous people I've ever met, also, by the way. I don't know if that was a question, that was just awesome. As it was. The committee stuff is interesting though, because you're right, particularly that security committee is where you see bipartisanship dissolve into this nasty blob of anything under cloak of national security is fair game. It's worth noticing when that committee splits on something. They did on facial recognition, which was weird. Not last year, but the year before, on this concept of facial recognition technology, of algorithms that are basically scanning you as you're walking down the street, matching you, are you somebody who's interesting to Peter Dutton? No, you're not, you can go about your business as a citizen. Like, the committee broke on that, and it's really rare that they do. What they normally do, and for a period of time it was all men, is that the thing comes in, they give Labor some kind of concession so they can vote for it, and then it comes out more or less in the shape that Dutton and his Greeks wanted it to be. And they knocked the crossbench spot off of it a couple of years ago, actually. Under the former government, there was a crossbencher, Andrew Wilkie was on there, who is former intelligence services and played, from my point of view, a very constructive role. They wiped that spot out, and then the next thing you know is this is bipartisanship, where it is difficult for non-government MPs or senators to say anything that would harm or threaten national security. And the government is daring you to do that. They are gagging for you to say something where you can paint it as soft on national security. So you see the same dynamic just roll out again and again and again. That is a tricky institutional nut to crack. And there are insiders trying to work on it. Last person who had who was in a position to do something about it, who had a bunch of creative, and I thought quite good ideas on how to manage that was actually John Falconer, a very long-term New South Wales Labor senator who spent years on that committee, and one of his parting gifts actually was a program for letting some oxygen and sunlight into that piece of the machine. What do we do about it? I think while there are allies and friends of good heart, Greens and Independents, and say, oh, excuse us. Well, hello. Michael Berkman, everyone. While we've got inside crew working on trying to unjam that little piece of institutional machine, I think having people go over the wire at Pine Gap and getting on television and talking about what these spaces do is actually better. For example, is do the provocative stuff, do the civil society organising, and don't wait for those parliamentary machines to fix this stuff for us. And I'm sorry that's not a super optimistic answer, but it's such a nailed down piece of the machine.
Disrupt land forces.
Disrupt land forces, for example. I don't know if we've got time to do some announcements, but that would be a really good one.
One really quick one.
Yes, sure.
Disrupt land forces.
Yeah, it starts on Friday night the 28th. When they start to bring everything in. So be there or be square. There'll be a fire sending signals to West Papua, and a fire in West Papua sending smoke signals back to
This
Australia.
sounds super Lord of the Rings. Are we really light the labs.
Aboriginal smoke signals.
Okay, but be where or be square. Where is this kicking off?
Yabra Hall fire.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right, we will unfortunately have to wrap it up there because we have gone over time. Scott will be inside, he'll be at the front of the store signing books. You can go in there, mill around, chat to him and get your book signed. And we will be selling copies at the front desk. If you could all join me in thanking Scott and Angela for a very much. Thank you.